when our mental sphere is activated in the way that it is now, especially with social media, we're living in a mental sphere. A lot of thought forms are arising, and some of them become independent, some of them become quite characteristic, and the ideas in which they form from, now people are speaking about them as if they are entities, as if they are beings. Nations are being spoken to in this way increasingly. So I wanted to ask you, from a Tibetan practice, when do the rites and rituals of creating these thought forms, could you give a bit of an overview of how they could be made almost by mistake or by unskilled forces here in the West? Is that something you could speak from?
I could, yeah. You know, as you probably know, I've written a little bit about this idea of the tulpa, which is, you know, it's a Tibetan word, and it's a very ubiquitous concept in Tibetan religions. It's kind of everywhere, actually, more than people realize if they don't like know Tibetan language. They often don't realize just how common the word tulpa is, because it's in Western occult context, it's become this kind of specialized term of art. And now, even outside of kind of card-carrying occultist circles, it's something that has pop cultural relevance. This is what I also wrote about in an old post about, you know, how the tulpa has been a recurrent sort of theme in TV shows like the X-Files. They've done multiple episodes on different types of tulpas, and also Supernatural, the TV show, has had at least one or two episodes. Now there's a kind of online subculture that's spun off from a variety of different subcultures, like Brony, My Little Pony subculture, kind of anime subcultures. They've all taken and run with these sets of ideas that I think students of occultism have been very comfortable with for a long time. This idea of a constructed thought form, of sort of applying intensive concentration and like meditative a focus to creating like an astral form that in some way becomes alive. And you know, how should I put this? Like, for me, as someone who has, you know, many years of experience of just being reading and practicing and spending time with Western occultists, and then also a lot of experience, especially as an academic and as a practitioner to a lesser extent in Tibetan Buddhism, what I noticed is that Western occultists really emphasize the idea that a tulpa is something that people can make and that they can make by accident. Um, and I think there's an intellectual history behind that. For me as an anthropologist, when I wrote that article on tulpas, what I was trying to understand is why Western occultists and paranormal researchers are so focused on that idea of the thought projection. Because when you go into Tibetan Buddhism proper, there's a kind of commonplace, almost like there's an almost like shrugging attitude around these concepts. What I mean by that is that in terms of the sort of ontology that you find in Tantra, the view of reality that you find in Tantra is that everything and everyone is already a tulpa. You know, like the entire way in which we experience reality is as mediated thought projections. There is really nothing else. And the way that we experience the world has to do with our particular karma, our particular bodies, and our level of kind of the vantage point that we're in karmically in terms of time and ethically in terms of accumulated karma and merit, and then our obscurations, you know, the veils or the filters that are determining how we perceive reality. So it's very common in a Tibetan Buddhist context for just to hear statements like, we are humans and we live in the human realm, and that's because we all have roughly equivalent karma, which has sort of informed the types of bodies we have, the sensory apparatus we have, the psychological qualities that we have. We see animals, regular animals like cows, dogs, and pigs, because they're very close to us, relatively speaking, karmically, and in terms of their quality of consciousness. Many of us don't see the myriad, infinite other beings that exist all around us, overlapping, overlaid over our world. Microscopic organisms. We don't see countless, innumerable pantheons of deities and spirits that are inhering in this moment at all times. But again, not all of them see us because they're not in alignment with us in terms of our karma, in terms of their vantage point of perception. And no being other than a Buddha, which by definition is not a being, we can get more into that, and is outside the whole edifice of samsara. No being sees all the other beings. They're all limited and constrained, and mediation, the extent to which different sentient beings can engage with each other depends on all these factors. Like I said, the quality of their consciousness, the refinement of their consciousness, and their karma and their particular bodies. And only Buddhas have, and this is where we get into the idea of tulpa as a broader concept. One of the chief qualities of a fully enlightened Buddha is that they have infinite emanative capacity. What that means is that Buddhas are able, willing, and always already infinitely radiating out magical emanations that are able to reach all throughout the entire dreamlike illusion of samsara. That's kind of their job. When we talk about what a Buddha does, its signature activity is emanation, is ceaseless. It's called in Tibetan. Um, they use this term gakme, or like gakpa meba, which means like without any obstruction, without any limit. That is sort of the sign that you are a Buddha, is that you are willing and able to do that. So other beings within samsara see themselves, they over-identify with their own emanation. But only a Buddha is aware of the fact, while it's emanating, while it's mediating with beings, that it is not a reified object, or it's in the system of illusory projections, but it's unstained by it. It participates fully in it, but it doesn't over-identify either with other illusory bodies or with its own uh, projection, which only exists in standard Buddhist theological terms because of love. Like the answer, why do Buddhas emanate? What is the fuel that powers that? The answer is compassion, love, the unceasing desire to wake beings up to the ultimate reality that they find themselves in. So why I'm going on this whole sort of cosmological tangent is because everything that we perceive is a relative conditioned appearance. It is a briefly arising illusory projection, a magical light show. And when we experience Buddhas in the myriads of ways, we also experience them that way. The only difference is that their orientation to their own projections and the projections they're interacting with, they're mediating with, is different. They are reality aware of itself as reality, engaging with aspects of reality that are not aware that they are reality. So it's the best analogy that Tibetan Buddhists traditionally uses of a lucid dream. They say a Buddha is in the dream, maybe appearing with a particular dream body that is a tool for interacting with and communicating with and mediating, acting in the dream with other dream bodies. But the only difference is that you're awake. And even though you have this dream body and it's sort of modulated by certain conditions or factors, you know in the moment of your perfect lucidity that you are all that you're arising from a common field of awareness that has no limits, that inheres in all of the appearances that are arising, but are not actually distinct. They only seem to be distinct. And that's what Buddhists mean when they say you realize innately, wordlessly, that forms and their inherent unreifiableness, their freedom from thinginess, their emptiness is is inseparable. So anyway, that's like a whole long discussion about Buddhists. I mean, to the best of my shitty understanding, but why I give that backdrop is because I think occultists they have this tendency, and I think we can trace the tendency back to probably two things:
Right.
to theosophy, um, and their general discourses on thought forms, and then the whole kind of set of like the whole like moral thinking and worldviews that they built around that. And it's kind of a bit maddening. It's like a funhouse mirrors because they themselves were developing those ideas in conversation with Indo-Tibetan concepts. Um, but then it's sort of this constant bouncing back and forth because then you have um, the fascinating figure of Alexandra David Neal, who was inspired by theosophy and to become a Buddhist, to convert to Buddhism. Like most Europeans in her time, like the early 20th century, she converted to this weird sort of what scholars call Protestant Buddhism, this kind of hybrid Western slash kind of South Asian reformer version of Buddhism through the lens of modern rationalism and Protestantism. And then she met Tibetan lamas and she was like, wait, everything I've read that white people have written about Tibetan Buddhism is kind of nonsense. It's not corrupt non-Buddhism. It's Vajrayana is the kind of flourishing of all the centuries of Buddhist practice and thinking before. And she started practicing. Then she writes about tantric ritual, which has, you know, we can get more into this, but when you break down a tantric Buddhist sadhana, it's all about playing with through visualization, through manipulation of material objects, through the vibrating of mantras. It's all about recognizing this kind of fundamental emanative quality of mind, of consciousness, tulpa. I didn't mention before this rant that the word tulpa in Tibetan means a magical emanation. It means a magical projection. But
And
it's
what
also
is a what is a tulku as a distinction of that?
Tulku is a very typical Tibetan contraction. So Tibetans
There's a
like to like
distinction between the two, right?
there is a
Yeah.
distinction, but they're very related concepts. So tulku comes from the fuller phrase trupe ku, um, which means the body of magical emanation or the magical emanation body. And specifically, it's in reference to the body with a capital B, what some people may know in Sanskrit as the kaya. So um, this is kind of like just like Catholics have the theology of the Trinity. And to an outsider, it's like, why do you care about this so much? Or like, what exactly does this mean? It's like a great mystery, but it's very animating for Catholics. In the same way, all Buddhists, and especially Mahayana Buddhists, have this concept of the three kayas or the three bodies, which arose in the history of Buddhism to explain better what the relation was between this human person in history called Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who had like a biography. He was born from a womb. His body decayed after death. I mean, he died in this very banal way. Like, we're not really sure. He ate like either poisoned mushrooms or poisoned pork, depending on who you ask. But he basically died of severe food poisoning. That's a very earthy kind of ordinary human way to die. And he did die. I mean, Buddhists don't deny that. But then at the same time, they say, well, he was a fully enlightened Buddha, and what he enshrined in his life was beyond space and time, beyond conceptual thought. So Buddhists started developing philosophical frameworks for explaining what is the relationship between Buddha nature, which is, like, as I said, beyond conceptual, beyond cognition, beyond ordinary thought, beyond space and time, not limited by any dualistic concepts at all, and which is also the kind of innate birthright of all existence. What's the relationship between that and then this dude who was born and died, and that was it? Like, and how can we call him the Buddha and then talk about universal Buddha nature and ultimate reality? And so what developed was this Trikaya explanation. So uh, you have what's known as the Dharmakaya in Sanskrit, um, Shuku in Tibetan, which we could say is the body of ultimate reality, reality with a capital R. So that's what the Buddha always was. As I was saying earlier, a Buddha is not a being. A Buddha is not a person with special powers or an enlightened person. A Buddha is undying, unborn, unstoppable, limitless awareness. Is the actual nature of consciousness unfolding with full awareness of itself. Um, so that's the Dharmakaya, and the way Buddhists talk about that is as kind of the basis of everything. Everything that exists is inseparable from the nature of the body of ultimate reality. Nothing is outside of that. And the nature of you and I is inseparable from the vantage point of a Buddha, not from our everyday unenlightened vantage point, but is inseparable from Dharmakaya. Then you have this sort of middle layer called the Sambhogakaya. And Sambhoga can be translated differently. Tibetans translated it as uh, uh, Lombe Zobeku. So like it was the body of complete enjoyment, or the body of total endowment with like riches. So that's what you have behind you on the wall. If you behind you have an image of medicine Buddha who's glowing blue and has these particular attributes, right? Particular kinds of hair and jewelry, a vaguely human form in this instance. But in some cases, Buddhas have very non-human forms. They have animal heads in Buddhist Tantra. They have like thousands of arms. They may not really have anything like human gender or sex. And so these are the astral bodies of the Buddhas. This was how Mahayana Buddhists could say, okay, there's an ultimate reality. And then from that ultimate reality comes uh, these infinite possible Buddhas. They've never existed in a human body. They're beyond space and time. They're made of light. Their bodies are not subject to any, they're illusory. Their bodies are holographic projections, and they just exist to express different aspects of enlightened awareness. So some of them are very peaceful, some of them are very terrifying, some of them are very horny. Um, So that's Sambhogakaya. That's what you usually see when you see images of Buddhas. That's the Sambhogakaya form. And then you have the Nirmanakaya, which is the Sanskrit word for tuku that you were asking about. The Tibetan translation of Nirmanakaya is tuku. So it's the emanation body. And that is what Buddhists said Siddhartha Gautama's visible body was. They said, anytime you, as a being in samsara, as a limited ordinary being, whether you're a god or a restless ghost or an animal, anytime you see a Buddha, anytime a Buddha communicates with you in a material way, um, that's a nirmanakaya. So the Buddha always said when he was preaching,
That's a tulku then.
that's a tulku.
Yeah.
Now, where it gets a little confusing is that with time, most people today know tulku as meaning something much more specific. That's the name given to lamas. Lama is just the Tibetan word for guru, so like spiritual teacher. Tibetans call any lama, any Buddhist teacher or Bombo teacher who has been recognized as a reincarnation of a predecessor guru. They call that a tuku. So that's the general name. So the Dalai Lama is the 14th tuku of the Dalai Lama line. Um, but what they're actually saying when they say, he's a tuku, is they're saying, he's a nirmanakaya. He is a human, tangible, and by ordinary perception standards, perishable, or she is a perishable human mediated form of Buddha activity.
Which
But
can have an accomplishment in its activity.
yeah, in see what happened was for a variety of like political, social, economic reasons, when Tibetans adopted Vajrayana, in Indian Tantric Buddhism, they over a period of centuries, in the early days, a lot of tantric succession, like the passing on of tantric knowledge and also the resources of gurus, like their physical holdings, that would often be passed on during the time of the Tibetan Empire according to hereditary succession. So you started seeing the development of these like lineages of hereditary tantric gurus who passed on their spiritual lineage to their nephews and nieces and grandchildren and children. And you still see this in Tibet in the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is still a hereditary tradition. Um, but then, kind of roundabout, like there were precedents for it before, centuries prior. This idea that Buddhas emanate in different forms, and that people maybe remember their past lives and so on, and continue the work that they did in another body. So, of course, very sort of general Buddhist idea. But around, I think it would have been what, like the 11th century, Tibet starts to institutionalize this idea that tantric succession can happen through a tantric guru dying and then consciously choosing to return as a human being. Because remember, generally speaking, Buddhists say that one, having a human rebirth is really great. It's like Goldilocks. It's just enough suffering and just enough endowments, just enough positive qualities. You're like perfectly positioned in your vantage point of consciousness to see through samsara. Because if you're a little bit too privileged, samsaric hallucinatory, the matrix that we're in is too fun. And if you're so dispossessed of cognitive ability or if you're just like in hell or you're an animal fleeing for their life or you're a fly that only lives for like 2 minutes, then it's not the best vantage point on which to really look at your own mind, look at your own consciousness and realize something about it.
So
So
it's slightly broke, living in a decent climate, academic life. It's perfect. This is like
yeah, 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 yeah.
you have chosen the perfect path.
Yeah, yeah. I think people often hear with Buddhism, they're like, oh, the precious human rebirth.
Mm,
I don't get that. My life kind of sucks. And they forget that it's a precious rebirth because
mm,
it's that like perfect middle ground. It's not actually fantastic. Like it's considered a higher rebirth than like an animal or a restless spirit or ghost in hell, a demon, but like it's purposefully not the best.
mm.
So that's one thing Buddhists
Great.
say. The other thing Buddhists say is that it's very hard to get one if you've already had one,
Mm,
because sentience is infinite in Buddhist thinking across multiple multiverses that are all simultaneously arising and dissolving. So the odds of you being born a human, very, very minimal. So the idea was that the reason these tantric gurus could choose to control their rebirth. I was talking earlier today, and accidentally I said rebirth control, which is a fantastic phrase. I think I want to do something with it. Like, are you on rebirth control? But tantric gurus have this. The idea is that they have this capacity which they've cultivated through tantric yoga. It's known as the yoga of poa, of projection of consciousness, which allows you to not just be rocketed into your next womb or your next incarnation sort of non-consensually according to just like your blind mental reactions and psychic tendencies. The idea is that you train before you die so that you're prepared for the death process and that you project your consciousness then either into a pure land, a Buddha dimension, which is like a wonderful spiritual pit stop where you can just kind of meditate for eons and rack up good karma, and so that it just becomes that much easier to become fully realized, or you
Is that a
become real.
siddhi? Is that a siddhi quality, or what's it called in Tibetan? Duptob? What is that quality
I
of
wouldn't
having
call
that?
it. I wouldn't call it. It's not one of the ordinary siddhis. No,
No.
um, it would be considered a yogic discipline. It would be considered a skill that anyone can learn. Of course, if you've mastered Poa yoga, then you can accomplish certain siddhis. For example, it often has the side effect of making you much more aware of dead people.
All right.
Because you can do poa on yourself when you die, or you can do it to someone else, even to the point that you can actually euthanize them non-consensually. Um, there's some very interesting stories about this, where it's possible for yogis, very bad, but it's possible for yogis to push someone else's consciousness out of their physical body, we are told, and then to actually take over their body. Um, this is a subset of poa. It's not a stronghold poa entering the city. Um, that being a euphemism for city being the assemblage of a freshly dead human corpse, the assemblage of a body. Um, so there are legends and tales about this power. But yeah, the idea was that highly trained tantric practitioners would automatically have some kind of agency over their future rebirth. And so, out of compassion, they would choose to, because human lives are very short, they would choose to sort of avoid an interregnum in the tantric lineage. It was also, to a certain extent, a kind of strategy for celibate tantric practitioners. Because in Tibet, tantric practice is done by celibate practitioners as well as non-celibate practitioners. And over time, monks and monastic celibate institutions kind of became the dominant power in charge of tantric expertise and knowledge. That's a whole other story. But if you think about it like this, having or claiming that you have the ability to choose where you will be reborn again as a monk who has no children that you can leave your monastery to or your holdings or land to or transmit because traditionally in India, tantric succession was usually hereditary, or like students who really became symbolically and practically the sons and daughters of their
But
guru.
never a bloodline. It was never something like that.
Well, yeah, very often it was
Oh, he
it
was.
was a
Okay.
blood, yeah, and
Okay.
it still is to a large extent. In Tibet, it gets complicated because very often, like, so like maybe you've heard of the famous guru who moved to the West, Tibetan Lama Namkha Norbu.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
like he and other lamas
The
recognized.
Crystal Way. No, the white the Crystal something book, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He
The
was a
Way of
Dzog,
Light, something like that.
yeah, he was a Dzogchen
Yeah, Dzogchen. Yeah.
master
Yeah.
and a scholar, and he has a son, um, a biological
He
son
always
who's
stares at me. Oh my gosh, Norbu's. He's constantly looking at me.
ah,
Yeah. Oh yeah. There he is. He always looks. Everywhere I look, he's always around.
yeah, there he is, yeah.
Yeah, he's always. And if I keep him around the place, because his eyes, if you look at his
Mm.
eyes, he's is like if you go to the left or to the right, he follows you. And
Yeah,
I'm
that's
always,
actually a hallmark of a Dzogchen yogi is that one of the requirements is this fixed stare.
yeah. And when I'm traveling, I'm always he's constantly looking. I'm always wondering, is he thinking, is he practicing, is he doing his things? So
Yeah,
I'm always
I
kind of
mean, yeah,
yeah.
well, that book is also a tulpa. In Tibetan understanding, it's also a tulpa. It's like there's this funny expression that's used in some teachings where they say that there's a level of the guru, there's a symbolic external projective form of the guru that's known as the guru with the black face who's never angry at us. And so what that means is it's in reference to script. It's in reference to Buddhist texts because Tibetans have these pecha, these loose leaf, narrow, thin texts, and they are usually block printed with thick ink. So if you thumb them constantly, it smudges the ink and makes them black with use. So they say the guru of the book is black. It's kind of a joke. It's like a Tibetan joke because usually if someone's black faced in Tibetan, it means they have like a stormy expression, like they're angry at you. But they say they're the black faced guru who's never angry at you because unlike a human guru, they'll never shout at you if you don't read them. They
Oh,
just sit there on the shelf,
okay.
and don't do anything, just waiting for you to please read them and benefit.
Okay,
Uh,
great. Because I was
and
always worried that he was trying to commute. He was trying to tell me something with his eyes. It's something that always.
I'm sure Namka Norbu wants you to practice more.
Yeah.
So you can be sure of that intuition. But the reason I bring him up is because he has a biological son, and his son, if I remember correctly, was recognized as the reincarnation of his own uncle, who was his guru.
Right.
So Namkha Norbu's biological uncle in Tibet was reborn as his son.
Wow.
So like in Tibet, what happened over time was these these different modes of succession, they overlap in extraordinarily complicated ways because somebody can be recognized as the reincarnation of a predecessor. So, like, let me give you the example of the Dalai Lama. Um, his lineage has traditionally primarily been a monastic lineage, so it's celibate men. As I was saying earlier, they're relying on the idea of truku, of the emanation body, of Nirmanakaya, to to find their successes by outsourcing wombs. So you're a monk. If you're keeping your monk's vows, you can't have sex ever. So, especially not sex with seminal emission, at any rate. We won't get into that story with Tantra, but like, um, so you're never going to have a child, ideally. Not to say that the monks don't break their vows all the time, but you're never going to have a child. But now you can say, oh, I'll just borrow this womb from a celibate couple somewhere else after I die. And that's how I'll have a child, but the child is actually me, despite also being a separate person. So this is how continuity is ensured. So if you look at the Dalai Lama, he's the 14th Chuku, um, which means he's the 14th reincarnation. He's the 14th reincarnation of. So okay, it's a little complicated. The first and the second Dalai Lama were identified retroactively. So the people we call the first Dalai Lama and the second Dalai Lama had never heard the term Dalai Lama when they were alive. Only the third Dalai Lama, he was the guy who got given the title and started the lineage. Then later, people said, oh, these masters from a previous time were actually also in this lineage. Anyway, the idea was that the Dalai Lamas were a very unique and special Tulpa. They were a kind of special and very powerful expression of Chenresi, of the Buddha of compassion. But the thing is, that's not that like uncommon. Many lamas are said to be, or many things or people or paintings are said to be special tulpas of Chenresi. Anyone who does Chenresi tantric sadhana every day is effectively a tulpa of Chenresi. And also, um, to get really technical, we're all tulpas because we're all just magical, illusory displays that are pretending we're these concrete subjects and objects and butting against each other. But if we related to reality in a more real way, we'd see that there's no subjects and objects. There's only the appearance of subjects and objects, which are real on their own level, but we over-identify them. This is a term that Tibetans use. We over-recognize our own thinginess. We do have a thingy quality, as Tibetans say. When phenomenal appearances, when you and I look at each other, when we interact, we really exist. It's not that like tables and chairs and lamas and gods are not real. It's that we treat them as if they are too real or real in the wrong way. um, and this is what they mean when they say, you know you have to realize that these projections are inseparable from their own emptiness. They cannot be found. This is what Buddhists are always saying. If you look for their inherent concrete, enduring self or thinginess, an owner that owns that appearance, you won't find it. That's what meditative practice is. It's looking into your thoughts, it's looking into your sensory perceptions and not finding a base thing you can hold on to, that you confidently say that's the essence. Um, and and so you let go. You actually just give up. As the Buddhist texts often say, you come up empty-handed. You went looking for concrete existence of all these seemingly concrete experiences and things, and you weren't wrong for thinking they were concrete and meaningful, because you're just reacting to them. You're not really getting into them deeply. But the deeper you look into them, the less substantial they become. And that's the point. It's not that you failed to find the basic level, true level of reality beyond the illusion. Buddhists deny that there's like a world of truth and then a world of illusion. These things are utterly interpenetrated. Form and emptiness are inseparable. Um, we're not looking for we're not doing archaeology. We're not looking for the deepest, truest level of reality, so we can just chuck out the world of appearances and magical displays. That's why this idea of the three kayas, right? The three bodies, says that there's actually no, conceptually we can recognize a distinction between these levels, but in actual experience, the nirmanakaya is always arising, and like all forms and impermanent illusory displays of life and death, all the appearance of beings, all identities, they're all coming up all the time. They're really, really there. The dream is really happening while you're dreaming. But if you're awake in the dream, you also recognize, these forms are much more malleable than I realized. There's a whole level of appearances which is beyond, the Sambhogakaya. It's like the astral level. It's beyond um, uh, the limits of my ordinary material life, my individual singular life. There's something more transcendent, more cosmic there. But then even beyond that, they also dissolve into emptiness. They also return to the basis of everything, which is inexpressible, which is beyond any words or concepts. But all those three kayas are one. Me saying that just sounds like mystical gobbledygook. Like it's meant to sound like mystical gobbledygook because it can only be understood as an experience. Um, Reading
When,
this stuff doesn't mean anything.
but
It actually means
when I hear you speaking there, I really got a strong image of a prism that that consciousness passes through a prism in which then we can contain form or mental formations. So
well, now Namker Nobu is speaking to you because that book, the crystal in the title of that book,
right.
um, that he's referencing is in reference to in tantric empowerment ceremonies, initiations. The fourth and last of the highest yoga tantra empowerments is called the word empowerment. And it's usually a verbal description, which is a bit of a, it's always doomed to fail because you're trying to describe something poetically that's beyond words. But it often also involves the showing of analogies or objects that are supposed to point out to you the nature of consciousness, the ultimate nature of mind. And the most common objects used to do that are a clear quartz crystal or crystal ball, which sunlight strikes to create a rainbow, a prism, or a totally clear reflective mirror. And this is in Dzogchen teachings how they talk about the three kayas. They say the Dharmakaya is defined by what they call the ngotomba, the, the empty essence, the empty identity. It's inherent essential emptiness. So the crystal is totally clear. It has no stains. It has no. Its only nature is like is transparent clarity, right? Then well, that's the next level of Sambhogakaya is the luminous quality of consciousness. Consciousness is unreifiable, it's non-local, it's has no inherent features, and yet it's lit up. It's like the sky. That's another analogy that's used. The sky, space is everywhere. It's inside your nostrils, your station tubes. It's out there. It has no limit. Can't hold it, can't grasp it. And yet it's luminous. It's filled with sunlight. So awareness has an innate quality of illumination, of awareness is itself a kind of, it's not it's not that the ultimate nature of reality is unaware, not switched on. It's switched on, it's aware of itself. And then that light filtered through the crystal is the Nirmanakaya. So usually the Nirmanakaya is described as the rainbow prism because Nirmanakayas can come in any form.
Mm,
Every color, every sensory arising you can imagine, and beyond imagining is possible. But the nature, the root of all that is an empty, transparent crystal that, to use the mirror analogy, the mirror can reflect any nirmanakaya on its surface. But the mirror itself is this like unchanging ground. It has a reflective capacity, which is the Sambhogakaya light display part. But the mirror itself is clean. Whatever, whether ugly images or beautiful images appear in it, the nature of the mirror never changes. It never becomes dirty or clean based on what images appear. If the images disappear, the mirror is still there. The ground of the Dharmakaya is still there. It's the backdrop of everything, just like when clouds or rainbows or rain appear in the sky. The space that's the matrix of all of this is still there. But just like with a crystal or a mirror or clouds in the sky or rainbow in the sky, you can't separate out. Cognitively, you can separate out rainbow from sunlight illuminating the sky from uh, you know the space itself. But in reality, in actual practice, none of those things can ever be picked apart. Just like the mirror's capacity to reflect, the things it reflects, and the surface of the mirror itself are inseparable. Um, so this is a Dzogchen kind of explanation of the nature of consciousness. How is it possible that we can experience all these forms, or a Buddha can even project a form and like not forget that it's a reflection in a mirror or a cloud in the sky? Because the only difference between us and a Buddha is that a Buddha is participating fully in all three kayas simultaneously, but never forgetting any of them, is aware of all of them at the same time. Whereas most of us are tulpas who don't know we're tulpas. Um, uh, and we're relating to other tulpas as if they're concrete things and we're concrete things and we're permanent, when the reality is that like that surface of the mirror is there the whole time. We can turn around in the middle of the movie and see the light shining on the screen. We can realize the basis of all experience. Often realized beings are described as the only people who have. I was just translating something yesterday where a yogi was saying, when you have gained Rangwang Tobetu, you will, nothing in samsara can harm or scare you. So Rangwang is an interesting word. It literally means own power, one's own autonomy. It's also used to describe sovereignty in terms of a country, like an independent country that's not ruled by somebody else.
Mhm.
Because in Buddhist philosophy, they talk a lot about how we're subject to external we suffer so much because we're always reacting to external conditions. We don't even own our own consciousness. We react to our own thoughts as if they're things happening to us. Uh, or things that we own, even. But if through meditation and practice you change your relationship to your thoughts and your sensory experiences, it's possible to have exactly the same experience you might be having now, but just not be doing it from the vantage point of clinging to a self. So the terminology that Tibetan Buddhists usually use is darzin, like holding on to the idea of a self. It's usually translated as self-cherishing or self-grasping. You can also see dak as meaning owner. So the problem is that we think it's not that we have experiences. It's not that there are forms and that beings appear and that this dream is happening. It's all about our orientation. It's all about how we relate to it and what our motivations are. So we can have a perception and an experience of separateness. The problem is if we believe it's kind of deeply inherently true. And so that's why, yeah, you're always trying in your practice to identify less with a self that is fixed and brittle and limited, and that has little room for other people's experiences, for compassion for others. So usually we get told, like I said, that bodhisattvas are emanating and entering into samsara over and over, trying to shake people awake just purely out of compassion.
Yeah.
Um, and
What is this mental projections? They need feeding, they need food, they need to eat. Would you find that when an embodied or a belief of an embodied autonomous being is there, like a spirit or anything like that, like a ghost, would they feed off? Because once you've taken away the belief, then there's no feeding for them. They cannot eat. But is
this is where I think like Western occultists and Buddhists part ways in
okay?
terms of their view,
Yeah.
because like you will often hear people say, "Oh, I," because I don't know, maybe I'm assuming people know the story, But to go back to Alexandra David Neal, um, she's really the mother of the modern tulpa idea, because you probably know this story already, but in her book about her travels in Tibet, at a point in her life when she already had read a lot of theosophy and been quite influenced by it. But now she's at a point in her life where she'd spent a lot of time in like Sikkim, Ladakh, on the Tibetan border with what's now modern India. She'd had Tibetan masters. She'd met the previous Dalai Lama already. Um, like she had gone to Tibet. She'd meditated in caves. She'd like gone up to yogis and demanded they teach her tantric yoga. She's a very dedicated practitioner. So she understood tantric sadhana by this point. But bear in mind, she's writing in French now for like a Western audience. And she tells a story in one of her early books where she says, like she always had psychic abilities, but she explains that like her practice of tantric sadhana enhanced those abilities. And she starts this account by saying she met like a Tanka jigen, like a Tanka painter. Tanka is like the tapestries, Tibetan images, religious iconography.
Mm,
And she met him in Tibet. And she said she was really startled because when she met him, she looked at him and she saw behind him, like looming in his aura. This was like the language she used. Tibetans don't have a concept of, well, they don't have exactly a concept of aura in quite the same way, but get into that. But she said she saw like kind of behind him his wrathful yidam, and yidam is a tantric meditational deity, and she was able to say to him, "Is your deity?" She doesn't say who it was, which like some Sambhogakaya form, because the yidams, the meditational deities, are that Sambhogakaya level, that light show, cosmic Buddha level. And then he confirmed, I think, if I remember the story, yeah, that's Maida. And then she asked other people about it, and they said, yeah, when someone is meditating every day, because this is what you do in tantric yoga, you do deity yoga. You know that your ordinary sense of self is actually much more fluid and less concrete and permanent than you feel it to be. So you use meditative mechanisms to dissolve it, and then you play with your emanative capacity. So you re-arise as the deity you've been initiated to, your Ishtavadeva, your Yida. And if you do this all the time, it is said that people with the right level of perception will see you sometimes as that deity. And there's some really fascinating stories from Tibet about this, because often someone will say, usually happens between like a guru and their student. Let's say the student is a very advanced practitioner. Maybe the student is also a guru and they're giving some tantric teachings to students. And then a couple of the students look at them and then they see them for a few seconds as the Yida. And this usually induces a lot of faith in the audience. They're usually like, wow, their meditation is so strong. Like I experienced them as the deity, as the Buddha expression. And when you receive an empowerment, you're supposed to tell yourself, just sort of pretend at least that you believe that your human guru is actually the Yida, is actually the Sambhogakaya, that the Nirmanakaya is actually the Sambhogakaya, and you're receiving the initiation from them. So the student is trying to perceive the guru in this pure way. But what's so interesting is often when a bunch of people randomly see a person, a lama, as the yidam, they often get scolded. Their teachers will be like, "Why do you let them see that? You should have kept that secret, because now your ego will get attached to people thinking you're an avatar, you're a divine embodiment. Because the whole thing with yidam practice is you don't need to tell anyone. My guru says your yidam is your secret lover. It's your private. You're in a relationship with a being that, like, of course, in practice, a lot of people know what practices you might be doing, because they were there at the teachings with you. Um, so, we can't be too like performatively like precious about this. But the idea is that your yidam practice is an internal cultivation. You're imagining yourself as that deity, not to try to impress anybody with your miraculous display. But it does happen that people pick up on it. And it's said that people who've done the mantra recitations and visualize themselves as the deity can kind of switch that on when you need. Because the sort of technology behind all tantric meditation is deity yoga. It's the idea that it's not you that's doing, because if you try to do magic from the vantage point of your ordinary limited body and mind, you're only going to get so far, right? Maybe you've cultivated your energy body, or maybe you are calling on the assistance of saints or spirits. But in tantric thinking, if you are fully identifying your body, your speech, and your mind with a transcendent deity emanation, a sambhoga kaya, you're not subject to the limitations of doing magic as your usual shitty self. Spirits also perceive you as the sambhogakaya deity. That's the big idea of deity yoga, that the authority you have over spirits. It's a bit like in Solomonic magic, where you're sort of aligning yourself with God or a holy guardian angel, or the headless deity of the Greek magical papyri. Before you command spirits, they're perceiving you as that authority, not as a regular person, you know, who sometimes forgets to like shake off after peeing and dirties their underwear, or, has these kind of really basic qualities. She sees him and then she's like, wow, people can do their yidam practice so strongly that like you can actually experience their yidam as like a separate power in their aura. So already her saying this, to my mind, kind of proves that she's still a Western occultist. She hasn't yet fully, because even that thought doesn't really make sense in, it's already kind of creating these weird dualistic categories that you're trying to dissolve when you do tantric practice. So even the fact that that's what she took away from that encounter, to me, feels like she's trying to impose like foreign categories on this thing. So then she starts thinking, she's camping in an area and she thinks, what if I, instead of doing my usual deity self-generation, visualization of a deity, because there's in tantric sadhana, there's two ways you can sort of invoke the deity. You can visualize them. It's called dunkye, front generation, where you imagine that they're in front of you, and then you make offerings and pray to them that way. Or you do what's typical of non-dual tantra. You dissolve your sense of self into emptiness, and then you arise as the deity, and then you emanate tulpas, little mini versions of yourself or offering deities, and you worship yourself, and then do the sadhana. Um, so those are the two models. So she was like, what if I use the methods of Tibetan tantric sadhana, but instead of visualizing, I assume she was thinking about front generation. She must have meant that. She was like, instead of visualizing the deity of my sadhana, I will visualize some random shit. So she was like, I'm going to visualize a little guy like who looks like a version of Friar Tuck from Robin Hood, like a fictional character. She must have had an image of Friar Tuck. I'm assuming she like read a book as a kid in France that maybe had some drawings that had inspired her. She purposefully chose that because she didn't want it to be Tibet iconography. And so then she said she spent days just like using the usual visualization techniques. She's not clear on like what she did exactly. Um, but she said she just built up this form. And then she claims that she kind of forgot about it. And a day or two later, all the Tibetans in the camp, the nomads and monks, started saying, there's a spirit here, there's a ghost here that's like hungry and it's around and it wants food from us and attention. and this is typical spirit behavior. Um, and uh, and then she saw it psychically. Other people described it, and it was basically this fat, jolly Friar Tuck European style monk she'd visualized had become over time gaunt and ghoulish and was skulking around like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings, like, obsessively looking for attention. And she was like, oh shit, I made that. And so she was like, oh, I had to destroy it. I had to dissolve it again. So I don't act, this whole story has become the like founding myth of modern Tulpa culture. Um, but I don't actually think that her explanation is possible in terms of standard Tibetan ideas, Tibetan Buddhist ideas about spirits and reality. I think a Tibetan would say, yeah, you created a visualized container. Because in Tibetan Buddhism, the idea of tantric sadhana is that you create in your imagination what is known as the Damtse Semba in Tibetan, or the Samaya Sattva. Samaya means tantric vow or commitment. It's usually translated as vow or commitment being. So the reason it's called that is because you've received tantric vows, which state when you get initiated that you have to regularly visualize your patron deity. That's one of your vows. So when you visualize that being above your head or yourself as that being, you are creating like a made up, it's called like churche in Tibet, a conceptually invented form. It's not real because it's a mental conceptual construction. It's not reality. In a way, it's almost like a veil to reality because you're using the conceptual mind. But in tantric terms, the way thought works is as a radiative capacity. The way thought is described, ordinary thought, is that thoughts radiate like light and then they condense. And when we fall asleep, thought has a different quality, a different granularity. When we're in a lucid dream, it has a different granularity, different texture. But thought is always like projecting out, making all these proliferated forms, and then it also can condense in and become very like uh, less proliferated, less elaborated, So when you do tantric sadhana, you use this mechanism. There's a name for it in Tibetan. It's called trinche. It's called trindu, which means radiating out and then dissolving or gathering back in. And this is the like kind of choreography, the mental choreography that you do in your sadhana. So typically, whether you're imagining your patron deity in front of you, or like above your head, or in your chakras, or like as your own body, you imagine this like very detailed three-dimensional light body. It doesn't have any organs, doesn't have any of the fallible impermanent qualities. It's just like a hollow light body, and it has all of these attributes which represent its energy, its expression of enlightened potential, or its action. So you visualize the deity in this form because it concentrates your mind. That's one reason. But it also is the way in Tantra that you manipulate lung, that you manipulate prana or energy by visualizing in a very focused meditative way. You're shaping energy. Um, and you're also creating a vessel that's stable. That's why your concentration has to be good. And then you imagine that out of the chakras of this, out of seed syllables or points of light in this imagined form, you radiate out light, which is sort of a kind of sleight of mind, a trick of consciousness to expand your own awareness. And you imagine that the light rays reach out in through the past, present, future, into every multiple dimension, and then they touch the actual Buddhas. So you imagine that the actual Buddhas, like their heart gets like struck by this light. All the Buddhas, the infinite Buddhas, and then they radiate out their light and their blessings. And or in other instances, the light rays are like hooks, and they pull in whatever energy or whatever experience or quality or whichever Buddhas or aspects of Buddhas or whatever blessings need to come in, and then they dissolve, they gather and absorb into your visualized form. And that in tantric parlance is known as the unification um, of the commitment being with the yeshe semba, the wisdom being, the jnana sattva in Sanskrit. And the wisdom being is what Buddhists, it's the name they give to like the actual essential presence of enlightened being. Of course, this is all kind of paradoxical because we know from this whole rant about the Trikaya that like Buddha nature isn't a thing. It isn't like astral light that we can pull from some special dimension. Um, it isn't like a finite resource. It isn't a resource. It isn't a nameable thing. It's omnipresent. It's our own nature. But what tantric ritualists know is that until we're enlightened, we're stuck in this world of dualistic projectivity. So they just say, how do we take what we know about the nature of reality and like work with the system from the inside out? Our thoughts are always radiating out and proliferating. They seem so concrete. They make all these light shows and then they dissolve. Our body appears and then it dissolves.